Thank you so much. So, you were a former McNair scholar, right? Um,
I was, yes.
oh, cool, cool. When did you do the McNair program?
You're putting me on the spot a little. As an historian, I'm not very good with dates, at least
That's
specific
okay.
dates. That's what I always tell my students in class. I'm always more concerned with the big picture ideas and big trends and change over time than I am with specific dates. But I was an undergraduate at UCSD between 1990 and 94. And so I believe I did some combination of McNair and the summer research program in the summers of 92 and 93, and I believe in uh, McNair during the 1993-94 school year, if I remember right.
So, what kind of friendships and connections did you build with the McNair program?
Yeah, it's funny because I think back to those programs and the folks that I met in the workshops and in the conferences and sort of crossing paths doing research and talking about what we are up to over the course of the program. And a handful of those folks are still close friends these many, many years, even decades later. Um, that's where I would start with just my peers, the relationships that I built with friends, and now they're really lifelong friends. Some who I knew going into the McNair program, having kind of crossed paths with them on campus and at other UCS points of our UCSD careers, but others that I met during the program really became folks that I connected with based on just sort of going through similar experiences, learning about the same sorts of things, and sort of aspiring to go on to graduate school or professional school, and using the McNair program as a launching off point for that. So my peers and the friendships I built, I think, were kind of first and foremost. And then, of course, I'd say the faculty that I was able to work with were another set of relationships that were really important, informative, and some really fundamental, foundational sorts of ways for me. Those are the folks that wrote letters for my graduate school experience and applications. Those were the folks that really sort of taught me initially how to do research, how to think about, at least for me, being an historian, history, and the big questions about, how the past shapes the present and really sort of informs our future and our struggles to make a better world. All of those things are, big open-ended conversations and discussions I had with my mentors as part of McNair very early on, probably, when I was a sophomore and junior at UCSD. And so I'd say those sets of relationships were really key, peers and faculty mentor. And then I'd also say, thinking back on it, you've got me kind of flipping through my historical Rolodex, the staff that worked for the program were really amazing. And I didn't always see it or recognize it back when I was a student. I see that side of things a lot more now as a faculty member who has on more than one occasion mentored McNair students over the years. But I thought about it this past year because I was on a faculty committee at UCSD, the Diversity and Equity Committee. And the staff person who was helping manage our meetings as faculty was formerly a staff person that worked with McNair and summer research. And this woman was really helpful for me back when I was a student. And then here we were working together again in a very different capacity, some 25 years later. And it was really kind of cool. So it got me thinking about everything that the staff does, kind of on, the front pages, but also behind the scenes that really make the program go. So that relationship and others I've had with staff over the years have kind of resurfaced since I'm back on campus now. But yeah, it's a really great question because I think the McNair program is so important because it gives people a set of experiences, but it really sort of gives people relationships and friendships and a kind of sociability that we don't always find in the academy.
Yeah. Do you talk about McNair with any of your students in your classes?
I do. I usually try to give McNair a plug here and there when I can. the other way I talk about it, both, beyond just it being an available resource for students, is I still reference some of those early moments of my own research career as a McNair scholar and an undergraduate student at UCSD in the lectures that I give when I'm trying to make the point to students that are sitting in the lecture hall, or these days, in the Brady Bunch screen in front of me, that we all sort of start somewhere in our research careers. And I remember very fondly, but also with some kind of intimidation and a little bit of trepidation and kind of confusion, but also curiosity, my first kind of forays into the historical archives that I did as part of the McNair program. I remember looking at archives at UCSD special collections. I remember driving up to special collections at UCLA, researching Mexican immigration in the 1930s in California, and still using bits and pieces of those stories that I experienced as a researcher for the first time in the lectures that I give as part of, for example, my HILD 7C course, which is the big Mexican-American survey class with some 400 students. I remember reading in the archives, for example, the stories that a guy named George Clements, who was the president of the Chamber of Commerce, if I remember correctly, in Los Angeles during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And his papers, his archive had all kinds of, different documents and points of view, but one was of Mexicans being sort of built for stoop labor because they were kind of naturally or organically built to withstand the sun. They didn't need as much water. They could bend over and crouch like this and sort of pull things up from the ground. I remember being so struck by that, seeing it in these old papers. And I tell that story in front of my class and always say that was, kind of my first stab at research as a McNair scholar. That's the kind of thing that kind of got me going and inspired me to keep wanting to kind of experience other moments like that, of just sort of getting that insight and that that historical perspective that is hard to find otherwise. And McNair was sort of the first place that I really got to play around with that.
Oh my gosh, that would have been very difficult to read and find. I'm glad that you get to share that with your students. That's pretty meaningful. I read part of your book for the Zoot Suits, and that was a really well written book. I very much liked that. I can't believe they're still banned to this day. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's a wild story. The Zoot continues to sort of capture the imagination in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah.
I mean, in that book, I only wrote about it in the span of a couple of years, except for, kind of the epilogue and the tail end of the book. But these many years later, 80 years later, it's still sort of this icon of youth cultural style and race relations in the US.
Yeah. So the immigration topics that you spoke about, you started that when you were an undergrad. And to be totally honest, I don't always remember what my specific McNair projects were, what my summer research projects were, and what my senior thesis were. They kind of blur together, but they were all sort of interrelated in a way, sort of around similar topics of, Mexican immigration, Mexican-American history, and thinking about race in the history of California and the border region more broadly. And I sort of was able to sort of do different pieces of that larger historical chapter, kind of post 1920s into the 1950s and 60s through McNair and these other programs. But the one piece that really struck or sort of stuck with me was thinking through the different meanings of race and being of Mexican descent in San Diego, California, and the border region more broadly over time. That those things really changed between the 1920s and the 1930s, and then moving forward into World War II, which is when the Zoot Suit stuff sort of really becomes topical and more popular, and then pushing forward more towards the Chicana movement and the civil rights movement. And it was McNair that really sort of got me to think about sort of change over time as an historian, working with Professor David Gutierrez in history, working with Professor Michael Monteon in particular. Those two, I believe I did the McNair program with. And then I think I also worked with George Lipsitz over in ethnic studies, who also did historical work. So working with that, really dynamic group of faculty was something that I didn't really have the opportunity to do otherwise in big classes or even small classes. I mean, they all sort of gave me the one-on-one time and sort of empowered me to, think about the past in a different way. But it was really that kind of changing meaning of race that stuck with me, and I think pushed me to want to read more and research more and learn more and ultimately go to graduate school.
Okay, so that kind of brings me into like one question, and it's we have a lot of students who are talking about like culture right now. So how would you define culture, and based on your experiences writing?
Culture is one of those slippery words in the English language or any other language for that matter. I've always sort of defined it broadly, kind of the ways that people make sense of the world. And that could, include the way they struggle to make the worlds that they live in better, whether it's locally, whether it's sort of more broadly, regionally, nationally, or even internationally. And that can encompass, things like popular culture, culture that is bought and sold as commodities, film, music, t-shirts, you name it, right? But it can also sort of be, those kind of deeply held belief systems that people have that shape the way they see other folks and the people and places around them. And for me, what's important about culture defined in that sort of broad way is that things happen inside of the world of culture that don't necessarily happen in other places in our lives. So one of the reasons I was drawn to culture was, one, I always loved music and film and visual art, but I had this kind of understanding, intuitive sense, really. It wasn't even like a conscious recognition, but that there were things that were said or done culturally that weren't always explicitly said or done in the context of other arenas, like elections, or like the press, or like labor unions. And that if we were able to tap into what people were saying, even if it wasn't conscious, through what they wore or what they listened to or what they played or how they danced with one another, that we would be able to sort of open up an historical world that might be otherwise lost, particularly in kind of the world of archives, which, for better or for worse, are often left behind by the people that, one, know how to write, and that, two, are able to save what they do write. And so oftentimes that's governments, and that's folks with power. And I sort of began early on, through the help of the folks that I worked with in McNair and other programs, like Dave Gutierrez and George Lipsitz in particular, to sort of think about culture as a way to get at kind of the lost archives or the unwritten records of history, and really listen with a keen ear to what people were singing, what they were watching, what they were performing, as a way to understand and make sense of the worlds that they were living in the past. And that sort of really stuck with me. So it really became this way to capture moments of history that might not otherwise be capturable, number one. And number two, for me, especially writing about African-American, Mexican-American women, other underrepresented folk, to capture their historical perspectives, which are often excised from larger narratives and stories of American history in particular, but history more generally. So really trying to include more diverse and multiple voices in how we make sense of the past. Because those folks have history too. We just don't always see it or hear it in the archives. And so culture becomes this really important vehicle and entry point into seeing the world.
I really appreciate that you are kind of talking about, what you see in history, but what life experiences have you had that kind of pushed you towards researching this area? What inspired you?
I think I always was drawn to the power of music in particular. Just sort of growing up in a house that, kind of valued music, always had it on. And in particular, I remember old reggae records that my dad used to play when I was a kid, like the early Marley, Jimmy Cliff, Peter Tosh records that I know for a fact sort of led to my own fascination with the reggae genre for many years. And I've written about reggae more recently on a number of occasions, including a chapter in my new book that's coming out soon. But I think that upbringing with music and sort of, again, a kind of intuitive sense that there's something really important and powerful here for lots of folks, but also just for me, because it kind of made me feel good. It made me see the world without necessarily traveling the world and hearing different people's perspectives in ways that I remember consciously at, sort of different moments in my life, and junior high and early high school in particular. So there's that sort of thing, just sort of coming of age and growing up around music and culture. And that had to do partly too with, I guess, my dad's side of the family, mainly. My mom's too, but we were always more connected on my dad's side of the family with my cousins and grandmother and grandfather and aunts and uncles and such. And music was always sort of an important part of that kind of familial atmosphere and kind of bringing people together. And I think I sort of, without ever really thinking about it, understood the power of music to bring folks together. And that's, if you cut to the chase, cut to the heart of it, that's kind of the way I write about music as a professor, is that it has this amazing power to bring folks together in different ways, in different moments, and for different reasons. The other thing that comes to mind is I remember having a conversation with my great uncle, Antonio, who was my great uncle on my dad's side, my grandfather's brother, my dad's brother. And he was a zoot suiter in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And I remember talking with him once in 1991 or 1992, maybe it was a year or two later. And he was telling me stories of his days as a zoot suiter in Los Angeles, when during the weeks he would work for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps camp as part of the New Deal. And then on the weekends, he would wear his one and only brown zoot suit from Friday afternoon when he got off work in the camps until Monday morning when he went back to work in the camps. And he generally spent Friday, Saturday, and Sunday with friends in Los Angeles, in East LA, just sort of strutting around in their zoot suits, doing their zoot suit thing. And that's how I was kind of first introduced to the zoot suit. And I ended up writing a paper that was based on an interview I did with my Uncle Tony when I was a senior in '94 at UCSD for a history of Los Angeles seminar that I took with Professor Bill Deverell, who now teaches at, I think, USC. And that ultimately turned into my first book, my PhD dissertation, and then my first book, and I dedicated it to my Uncle Tony. And his interview that I did as an undergraduate at UCSD was still part of the book. And I remember when I gave him a copy of the book, I took it to the retirement home where he was staying up in North County, Rancho Penasquitos, or somewhere up thereabouts. And he kind of looked at the cover and, flipped to the back page and said, wow, 312 pages, Luis, that's impressive, and then closed it. I don't know if he ever opened it again. But it was really nice just to sort of give him a copy of the book. And, so I think about, the family parts of my own history that kind of connect me both to culture, but also to my own kind of Chicanx, Latinx, Mexican American history and heritage on my dad's side, with a kind of long history and deep roots in San Diego and Southern California and Baja California in particular, that kind of drove me to sort of think about this mix of race, of culture, and of Latinidad and Mexican American history in particular.
Okay.
Nearly 90 when he died. This was more than a decade ago. But he was, even in his later years in life, he paid very close attention down to the detail in terms of how he looked and how he dressed. Even as an old man, I remember my wedding, he was, decked out in this very sharp white suit. It wasn't a zoot suit, but it could have been from back in the day. And he was on the dance floor, cutting rug, but just always sharp, always looking his best. And that stayed with him his entire life.
Oh, that's so cool. That's really cool. Was the excerpt that you wrote with him part of the McNair program, or was that like a separate project?
You're forcing me to like pull some strands apart that haven't been pulled apart in a very long time. I don't recall. I think I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't recall. Yeah, it may have been, but I can't say for certain.
Okay. All right.
Some historian I am. maybe not. Who knows?
That's perfectly fine. I really like that story. It's so cool. Do you talk about that interview with your students?
I do. Yeah. No, I talk about my Uncle Tony quite a bit. One of the things he told me in that interview was that because he was a tall dude and he had broad shoulders and he would always wear the pancake wide brimmed hat that was part of kind of the zoot suit signature look and style. And he always said if you weren't that tall and if you didn't have broad shoulders, you would just kind of be short and squat and you'd look like a thumbtack if you wore that hat or that style hat. But the point he was making, at least the way I understood it, and this is what I tell my students when I tell that story, is that, looking good or being stylish wasn't just about looking good or having style. It was, but it was also more than that. In the context of World War II, for Mexican American and African American youth like my Uncle Tony who wore the zoot, it was partly about being seen and heard in a moment when they were supposed to be silent and invisible, right? Which gets back to the point that I was making about, why culture, and in this case, the zoot suit matter as a kind of historical focus of our inquiry as scholars and historians, is because they can let us know what folks like my Uncle Tony thought of the United States and California and the home front during World War II. They didn't necessarily leave behind records. I was fortunate enough to interview my Uncle Tony, but a lot of them didn't leave behind records or interviews, but we can sort of interpret their clothing and their dance style and their tattoos and their ducktail haircuts and their cross-racial dancing and socializing and partying with one another in ways that sort of tell us a lot about what they thought about the segregated sensibilities of the United States during the 1940s, about what they thought about the home front and sort of this cry for, kind of unification to defeat fascism overseas at the same time that they weren't afforded first-class citizenship on the home front, despite being expected to join the Navy or the Army, as my Uncle Tony did. He ended up being a cook in the Navy, or my grandfather, who ended up also joining the Navy and fighting in the Pacific, and then couldn't get a haircut in downtown San Diego when he came home wearing his uniform. So, it's that sort of thing that, I think the world of the zoot and culture kind of opens up, is that these youth did, in fact, leave behind something for us to read and hear and listen to. We just have to kind of search for it as historians. And they made it pretty easy in the case of the zoot because it's hard to miss. But that's sort of the way, the historical methodology and the kind of cultural history methodology that I try to get students to think about when I tell the story, the thumbtack story from my Uncle Tony and others. But yeah, I do talk about him, quite a bit. It's hard for me to talk about the Zoot at all or think about it without thinking or talking about him.
Yeah.
So he's been part of many of my lectures and my sort of book talks over the years, more than he probably ever would have guessed.
Yeah, okay. How is the publication process for writing your books? Like, what steps did you take? How to turn like your research to like an actual finished product?
That's a great question. And, that is one that takes some time. And I'm just sort of on the tail end of it for another book now. So you're asking at the right moment, at least for me. In the case of the Zoot Suit book, that really began with that interview and paper I wrote as an undergraduate, it took a graduate student career to write a dissertation, which was 6 years of graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin. And really the dissertation was 2 years. And I always think of somebody's graduate PhD thesis as a first draft of a book, even though it's sort of its own finished product because you get the degree and you graduate with a PhD along the way. But it really took about 2 years to research and write my dissertation, which included interviews, which included trips to archives all across California and in New York and in a few other places, and reading basically everything I could, not just on Mexican American and African American history or on cultural history, let alone the Zoot Suit, but on World War II and race. You have to read a lot, you have to research a lot, and then you get to the writing part. And the writing part is not always easy because, as part of what's great about McNair is that it helps teach us how to do things as scholars and students. And I say scholars and students broadly defined because we're scholars and students as undergraduates and we're scholars and students as senior professors also. But it teaches us how to do things that there aren't always other venues to learn how to do, like do the research, like sit down and write a paper that's longer than 5 pages. And those are things that in graduate school, you're expected to do, to write a 200 or 300, 400 page dissertation, but not everybody knows how to do. And not every graduate program is equipped to teach somebody how to do that. And so McNair actually put me in a place where I sort of had a little bit of a head start and a little bit of a sense about how to do primary research, dig into archives, do oral histories, and sort of translate that onto the written page in the form of a chapter or at least a section. And that, for me, still, these many years later, is not an open and shut, easy process. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of experimenting, how to organize evidence and information, how to analyze it and interpret it, and then how to spit it out in the form of a relatively, hopefully compelling story about the past that people will actually maybe want to read, at least just a little bit. And so that whole process, the research part of the puzzle, the writing part of the puzzle, including the interpretive and analytical part of the puzzle, are all really kind of intertwined. And for me, they kind of feed off of one another. And so I like to think of the research process as part of the writing process and vice versa. But in practice, I mean, like nuts and bolts wise, everyone kind of has their own process, I think. For me, even to this day, it's lots of outlines that are being constantly revised, outline. I will outline the whole thing. Like if it's a book project or an article or a chapter or the section of an article or a book chapter, I will outline. And so, my outlines are sometimes a little less so than back in the day, but still for the most part on hard copy and written by hand, because that's just sort of how I work best. And I just sort of need to sort of see how I'm organizing the different pieces of information that I have into a coherent storyline. It's almost like a storyboard, right, of a TV show or something like that. I have these different pieces and characters and arguments that I want to fit into my narrative, and I'm not sure how it's going to come together. But once I sort of see all the pieces before me in outline form, then I can kind of move them around in different sequences and different order, and ultimately settle on a organization that is hopefully as effective as I want it to be. But it begins, I think, just with asking questions and being curious and wanting to inquire about people and places and moments that we find intriguing and compelling for one reason or another.
Okay.
And then everything sort of takes off from there for me.
So based on your research now, would you have changed any details in your prior books or your prior papers? Is there something that you found now based on your old experiences that would cause you to want to change things that you've done before?
The publishing process is a strange one because it's never really finished. Even when a book or an article is in print, it continues to have a life because people read it, hopefully.
Mhm.
People ask questions of it, and it is discussed, whether it's in a discussion section or at a conference panel or a graduate seminar. And so it continues to live, right? Even though it's quote unquote done, it's out there in the world bumping into other books and articles and arguments and interpretations and thoughts out there in the universe. And, that means that it's always going to be out there. It's always going to be part of these conversations, hopefully one way or the other, at least for an extended period of time. And so I don't necessarily get too caught up in thinking about what I would have done differently, as much as I think about what I would add to the conversation now or in the next thing that I write or in the next lecture that I deliver to students or to the public. Because I think the book could always be more. I could have done more research. I could have interviewed more people. I could have looked at more archives. I could have written another chapter. When I first envisioned the Zoot Suit book, the Zoot Suit was the first chapter.
Mhm.
And then there was like 5 more chapters on other aspects of the cultural relationship between Mexican American and African American youth since World War II. But I ended up writing the whole dissertation and whole book just on the first chapter of my original outline and proposal. So there's always something more you can do. And I am sort of, cool with putting it out there in the world in the form that I thought it best to take at that particular moment in time, with the understanding, especially with hindsight, that look, that book is, 10 or 12 years old now, and other people might think differently about that period of time or the folks I wrote about or the Zoot Suit. I think it stood the test of time pretty well, but I'm less concerned with sort of having done or wanting to do things differently than say, okay, what am I going to do next? Or sort of how can we continue the conversation in other forms? Because a book could always be done. And at some point you got to just kind of pull the plug and say, this thing is ready for the world. Let's see how it goes.
Okay. Have you had a moment with any of your students where you just really felt like your story, like they might be part of your legacy going forward? You had mentors at the time that you've talked about with a lot of respect, and you seem to have gotten a lot for them. Do you think that any of your students now will carry on your legacy?
Wow, that's a pretty big question. I would legacy, I don't know anything about that. I would like to think that I have been part of relationships and helped build relationships that includes guiding folks, helping them think about what they want to do with their professional lives and how they want to make the university and the world a better place. I'd like to think I've offered something to somebody along the line. It's not really my place to say, but I think, you know, across the board, from kind of the individual students I've worked with in McNair or other programs like that, where we get a chance to really get to know one another, you know, over coffee or in office hours, just kind of sitting face to face for more than just a few minutes. I'd like to think that I've had an opportunity to help them in lots of different forms, including letters of recommendation, including reading their stuff that they've written for me or for other classes, or for just sort of helping them through moments that are challenging in their lives, academic or otherwise. In my classes, I'd like to think that the kind of stories I tell and the kind of ways that I try to present history have helped my students, even the ones that take the class for a GE or don't care about history or don't care about race or this, that, or the other, but sort of end up in my classes by accident. I'd like to think that I've helped them think about the world in a more informed and at some level critical way. This last couple of years, I haven't taught this class. This is an example. One of the classes I used to routinely teach was called the History of Race and Riots in the US, Race, Riots, and Violence. And, you know, I haven't taught it this last 2 years, one, because I was on sabbatical, but nonetheless, from having taught that class for a decade plus at UC San Diego, in the context of Black Lives Matters and the resurgence of the BLM movement over the last 2 or 3 years, since spring of 2020, I've gotten emails out of the woodwork from folks around the world. I mean, somebody who's living in Amsterdam, somebody who's living in London, somebody who's living in Australia, I think, folks scattered around the United States, including here in San Diego, saying that in the context of the headlines and sort of the public debate around race and the resurgence of BLM, that they were thinking back to our class together and realizing that they had an understanding of our current historical moment and something to say about what was happening around us that they would not have had otherwise for taking the class together on race, riots, and violence. And that's a class that we start way back in the late 19th century, and then we end up, you know, in the present. But it's also one of those classes that's always about the conversation between the past and the present. And sometimes I say this in class, it's like a broken record, because we could be talking about the New York City draft riots in the 1860s. We could be talking about Watts in 65 or Detroit in 68 or Atlanta in the early 20th century, what have you. Or we could be talking about Ferguson. We could be talking about La Mesa, California. It's just southeast of San Diego in 2020, or you name it. And I think that example, you know, is one that I think of when you ask me that. And you know, there's lots of undergraduates that have gone on to graduate school that I've worked with too, that I've written letters for, that are now, you know, professors, places that are tenured and have their own books out, and sort of being part of people's own journey through creating knowledge and putting it out there in the world. So it's not just my book, but it's their knowledge that's out there bumping around in the universe, creating a place where people know more. and different voices and perspectives are all part of the conversation. The other thing I'd say is that because I have an interesting history with UC San Diego, because I was here as an undergrad back in the day in the early 90s. I was here as a postdoc in the early 2000s. And then I came back as faculty in the mid 2000s, and I've been here now for 15 years or so. Is that I oftentimes connect with students who want to see the university do better for them in all sorts of different ways, because I remember wanting the same thing, not only now, but when I was an undergraduate in the early 90s. I remember sitting in and organizing for a cross-cultural center that we didn't have back then, but that we have now. And it's an amazing community center on campus, an institution, a really important resource and physical space in Price Center East for people to do really important work. I hold my classes and office hours there sometimes, and that's just one example. But the university continues to need to be pushed by students, undergraduates in particular. And that's, another place where I think, McNair cultivates, independent, autonomous thinking. That, yeah, we're here to learn from and, kind of represent the university, but we're also here to, critique it and hopefully make it better. And I know that a lot of the students I work with, we connect on that point as well.